I'm a postdoc at Åbo Academy University. I work with Christopher Boström on seagrass ecosystems. So we are working on ecosystem restoration and species interactions in eelgrass meadows mostly. So why soft bottom ecosystems? They're one of the ecosystems that's been lost at the greatest rates. So things like oyster beds have been 85% lost around the world. Seagrass meadows are estimated at 30%. Mangroves at 35%. And we're particularly focusing on seagrass meadows because they have a really, really low restoration success rate. It's estimated at 37% from a recent meta-analysis. And it's also by far the most expensive system to restore, even more than coral reefs. So that combination of really low success and really high cost is not going to convince managers or governments to invest in seagrass restoration projects. It's kind of a losing proposition if you want to restore seagrasses. So what we want to do is look at what techniques could we use, what methods could we use to increase that success and possibly drive down the cost. There have been a few studies that have looked at how to increase restoration success in seagrass meadows, but also in other ecosystems. The first most important one seems to be prior to attempting ecosystem restoration, to make sure that habitat degradation is reversed. So that means if we're trying to restore in an ecosystem that's been subject to high levels of eutrophication, but the nutrient input is still ongoing, it's probably not worth trying to restore that until the nutrient input situation is solved, because it's just going to die off again. The other ones are things like to select the transplantation habitats carefully to make sure that they're actually suitable for the habitat in question. If they're not, then to modify the habitat so that it is suitable. To use appropriate transplantation techniques, which will depend on the species in question. Large-scale planting increases success, although at the same time it also increases cost. And then there have been some work that looks at spreading risks in space. So instead of focusing just on one site in one intensive effort, to maybe do several sites around so that even if one fails, you still have successful restoration. And finally, we're going to focus on the role of interactions and feedbacks between seagrasses and other types of ecosystem engineers. Seagrass, you can't just plant it alone and expect it to survive. There's a bunch of feedbacks and interactions that occur. We are focusing on seagrasses and bivalves. We started off with a literature review of plant bivalve interactions, and interactions are mostly positive. So about 53% of the interactions were positive, but there are also negative interactions. So what we want to do is promote these positive interactions and reduce the negative interactions when we're transplanting seagrasses. In the Mediterranean, we have several different seagrass species. These are all subtidal sites in the Mediterranean. And then in the Northern Europe, the Netherlands have intertidal sites, whereas the three other countries are all subtidal. And this is the field experiment, the joint field experiment that's in Norway, Finland, and Estonia, planting seagrass with blue mussel, seagrass alone, and blue mussels alone. From this, we will measure seagrass growth, seagrass shoot density, blue mussel growth, blue mussel condition, pore water nutrients, sediment organic content, microbial samples, etc., etc. This is at one of our sites in the Archipelago Sea here, and you see there are macomas there. This is kind of natural densities. And yes, this is plastic that we are putting into. I know there's a question coming about that. These will be harvested after 1 year or two. So we're not leaving them there. But that's also why we're testing biodegradable structures, so that instead of doing this, we could use an actual structure that's plastic, but that will degrade within, it's not really plastic, it's made from potato starch, that will degrade within a few years. So enough time for the zostra to establish itself, and then the support will kind of dissolve away. So these are blue mussels that were harvested from a site adjacent to this. We are putting a lot, quite high blue mussel density here. because they do tend to be washed away. So we're putting a lot here, and maybe 30% of them will actually stay after a month or two. So that's one plot, and these are 25 centimeters by 25 centimeters. And there are 36 of them in 2 sites. We've also had problems with sediment at sites where seagrass used to be, but after seagrass has disappeared, the sediment tends to change. In some places, we've had burial of sites in Estonia, whereas in Norway and Netherlands, they've had problems with erosion, so that the whole plots are washed away. One of the sites in Turkey, there's a problem with herbivorous fish. And in Finland and Estonia, we've had problems with algal mats. And this goes back to what I discussed earlier, that we should maybe attempt to deal with eutrophication before we actually try to restore things. So this is one of our seagrass meadows, not the one where we did the restoration project. But under here, under all this algae, which is about this thick, there's actually a seagrass meadow. Hard to believe. So we're supplementing the field experiments with aquarium experiments. The benefit is that then we can pinpoint mechanisms, control densities of bivalves that we add, control other things, and we can make sure that our bivalves aren't washed away. We have some very early results showing that mussels might increase seagrass growth through fertilization. So there might be some benefit to mussels promoting restoration. We also supplemented this with more aquarium experiments in Sweden using flume aquaria. So Lucas and Christopher went to Kristineberg to use flume aquaria using, again, eelgrass plus 2 other bivalves, again, blue mussels and the oyster. So these are laminar flow aquaria, so they simulate unidirectional flow. In this case, the water is going this way. So this is very useful in tidal systems where you often get long periods of flow in one direction. So what happens is, as the water is going this way, it tends to form these holes behind any structure that's in its way. This experiment, they looked at seed retention. So eelgrass seeds, which you can see here. These are actual eelgrass seeds that are released here, and then they see where they end up, if there's different densities of seagrass or if there's different densities of bivalves. So the water is coming from here. And there are seeds being released. I don't know if you can see them in the back, but there's one here, and there's another one coming. Can you see anything at the back? Yes, okay. Yeah, so there's more seeds coming here. And if you watch where they stop, they tend to stop in these holes that have been kind of dug out behind the oysters. Whereas if you, I don't have the video, if you put nothing here, they just go straight through. They don't stop.
This is like watching ice hockey. I never find it.
The early results show that oysters especially, mussels also, but especially oysters, do help seed retention in eelgrass meadows. So this is especially important, not so much in the Baltic because we don't have seed production, but for places like the west coast of Sweden, where once you have your meadow and you plant bivalves in addition to it, then when the meadow comes to reproduce, this will help it. There will be higher density because the seeds will be retained within the meadow. So why do we use flumes to study ecological interactions rather than just normal aquaria? They're a lot more work and expensive. But it's because hydrodynamics are a huge structuring force in coastal communities. And we deal with it in field studies, obviously. But when we come into the lab and do aquarium studies, we usually use still water aquaria. And those are very different systems. So this is from the UK. This is a kind of a classic exposed shore here, where barnacles are especially kind of the dominating ecosystem engineer here. Whereas this is a sheltered coast where you have fucoids coming in. Hydrodynamics affect algal attachment time. They affect algal attachment strength. So algae that attach to a substrate in high hydrodynamic conditions tend to be much stronger. They like thicker hold fast. It affects physiology, so things like photosynthesis. It affects morphology of both algae and grazers. So grazers, for example, in wave-protected, so sheltered sites, tend to be larger than those in wave-exposed sites, but they have thinner shells because they don't need to invest as much energy into thicker shells to protect them from waves. The hydrodynamics also influence grazing intensity and thus top-down and bottom-up control. There's a bit less done in soft-bottom ecosystems like eelgrass meadows, but we know that the current speed can affect above and below ground biomass ratios in seagrasses. So seagrasses in very hydrodynamic conditions tend to have longer roots, but shorter canopy height than those in calm conditions. So they need the longer roots to anchor themselves more strongly. There's obviously differences in sedimentation and erosion dynamics, differences in morphology. There might be differences in carbon storage due to sedimentation and erosion, because it seems carbon is really stored in eelgrass meadows. And again, we might have differences in grazing intensity and thus top-down and bottom-up control. This is wave flume. This is actually one of the ones in Kristineberg that's been converted into a wave tank to show what happens to the seagrass meadows when it's exposed to waves. This is not exactly what we're getting in Finland. The ones we're getting don't have the glass side, unfortunately, so we won't get nice videos like this. And you can see already here the ripples forming in the sand, which you don't get if you're doing experiments just in a kind of normal still water course. So you can imagine already running experiments in this versus running experiments just in your seagrass sitting there in an aquarium is going to be very different. This, for example, is you can see the seagrass moving here in the waves. You could look at mussels with seagrass and without seagrass. Behavior, physiology, there's so many things that could be done, that's been done in still water tanks that could also be done in flume aquaria. And we are, looking forward to collaboration, although maybe not this summer already. We would like to get the system up and running first. But from 2019 on, so please think about it. If you have any great ideas for running things in flume aquaria, we'd love to hear from you. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.